Hello, my name is Brant Hunt, and my channel is simply called Discerning What is True because I'm seeking truth. That's all I care about. You see, money doesn't, money is not the deal here, folks. We just don't pursue that. That's not going to get us anywhere. So I'm going to read the book by Tom Harpur, it's spelled Harpur, The Pagan Christ, the name of the book that was written 20 years ago, actually, in 2004. And this is chapter 10, The Only Way Ahead. Now, earlier today, I did talk about Tom Harpur a little bit. Tom Harpur never really actually came to the idea of ascension. He came to the idea simply of reading Alvin Boyd Kuhn's works, which are very eye-opening and are deep. That's not the complaint here. I'm not trying to put this guy down, but I want to advise you that simply is all Tom Harpur is doing is rehashing what he learned from Alvin Boyd Kuhn. The two major theosophicalists, that is, would be, in my mind, would be Gerald Massey and Alvin Boyd Kuhn. But they only discovered that basically the scriptures were not literal. In other words, at their time phase, they were allowed to, quote unquote, to understand that the Bible itself is not literal, which so many Christians believe. And actually, not even Christians, others believe, you see. But they didn't discover, or they didn't themselves, Alvin Boyd or even Gerald Massey, never discovered that actually the book is actually a book of somewhat what we call riddles, sayings, and metaphysical, that is. This book here shares this information here of particular names. For example, here I've got a name here, which is a very well-known name in the Bible, a very unusual name, which is called Methuselah. Hebrew means the man of God. That's based upon Genesis 4:18. And what it's referring to with Methuselah is to do with the new birth. So that would reveal, in my opinion, that he simply found God inside his head, not outside of himself. The word the Messiah here, this is a Hebrew, means anointed, which just comes from Daniel 9:25, which means simply God's anointed for man's redemption. Now that's why we call Jesus the Messiah. That is, he's anointed for man's redemption. But he wasn't literal, you see. He wasn't literal. Jesus never lived, he never lived on this planet. You see, I spoke to someone yesterday talking about simply is, or I shared, why would God choose to become a man? So why would he? Okay, Absalom's truth. Are you Trinitarian? That's not the point, Absalom. I'm not really interested in looking at the Trinitarian review point. That's a religious perspective. Um, that's just coming up in what I call the paperwork or the sayings from a religious dogma. That's not important here. Okay, I hope you understand that particular question doesn't come in my mind. I'm interested in being ascended. I'm not interested in talking about Trinitarianism. Trinitarianism is just another man's clever way of looking at Scripture in a literal terms, which is false. So let me get back to what I was sharing here. The Pagan Christ, which is what this gentleman wrote, Tom Harpur, and other slices do with what I would call a gentleman named Alvin Boyd Kuhn. They discovered, that Jesus was not a literal person, you see, which was a stumbling block for all Christianity. Okay, but they never came to the point simply of knowing the riddles, these sayings, and the quote unquote, what I would call the metaphysical perspective of the scriptures. Why there's certain letters, but not certain weird names. Absalom, Methuselah, Messiah. Where would you get these words at? You see, all right, and also to do with the Jordan River or the Dead Sea. You see, So let's get into the reading here of this work by Tom Harpur. Tom Harpur simply is gleaning what he understood and what he was reading about basically the works of simply is that of Alvin Boyd Kuhn. So this is chapter 10, The Only Way Ahead. And what this is talking about simply is, as he goes into this, is to talk about cosmic Christianity. The historical Jesus as a civilizing influence has now been tried for nearly 20 centuries. With a weird irony, not only has it not in large measure elevated humanity in the West above an earthly barbarism, but it has in fact been used as a cloak for the worst atrocities and humanitarian actions that history records. The foulest cruelties were perpetrated in this very name of the gentle Nazarene, that is. It will behoove humanity in the West now to try the concept of the indwelling Christ, the hope of our glory. This is a statement from Alvin Boyd Kuhn from the book called The Root of All Religion. So what he's talking about here simply is that Catholicism, and even later on Protestants, but more to the atrocities of what the Catholics did, was if you did not believe in what they taught, they killed you. Pure and simple. Okay? This is why people don't want to face this. They don't want to stand, they don't want to deal with this. But this is atrocities that were done in the name of God. In other words, this is their perspective. It simply is if you wasn't with us, you were no longer going to be in the human race. We were going to kill you. Which really doesn't reveal any love of God or Christ or anything of that nature, which reveals that simply as they were false teachings of what they were teaching. And those atrocities took place. Millions and millions and millions of people lost their lives because of these people and their belief system. That's what happened, folks. That's reality. I know this simply is the 15th century. The quote-unquote Roman Catholic Church and the Protestant Church attacked the Anabaptists. Do you know that? Do you understand what they did to people back then? This was in the early 15th century. 15th century. If you didn't go along with them, you were considered a heretic. Do you understand the dividing line here? You have it much easier now than you have in the past, folks. This is reality, okay? But I just want to point this out that the Catholics saw themselves as actually the true people of God. In reality, it was as far away as they could be. In fact, they were doing the works of Satan and devil, you see to speak. Let's continue on. It would be misleading to leave you with the overall impression that the conclusion we are about to examine came at me like some bolt from the blue. Faithful readers of my precious books, or previous books, I should say, and of my columns over the years will know that I have been steadily and inexorably pushed by the Spirit towards the independent realization of many of the truths expressed much more boldly and fully in this volume. This is especially the case with my previous book, Finding the Still Point, where I made my strongest case yet for the indwelling presence of the divine. That is, he speaks of the divine being incarnation, in close here, in the life and soul of every human being. That book was already at the printer before I had read even a line of my major source author in this present book. Those who remember my much earlier work called Life After Death may recall that in the chapter entitled, quote, The Christ Myth as the Ultimate Myth of the Self, end quote. I reasoned that the story of Jesus was indeed the story of every person, and it gains its true meaning and relevance for us only if it is seen in that light. Whether there ever was a so-called historical Jesus really makes no difference to the meaning of his story or mythos or our lives. So I don't know if I agree with that statement. There's a pretty, the historical Jesus something doesn't mean anything. I was reading something last night about Paul. Paul never in his writings talks about the historical Christ. He never talks about Jesus, so to speak. You ever notice that? He doesn't talk about Jesus. He doesn't even such and such. He doesn't seem to be he's a different character, so to speak, you know? He's kind of a maverick somewhat in some ways too. I don't know if that's meant to be or not, but I think simply is that you should look into that and realize it simply is that I don't think Paul was going to fall in this line of step. Now, this could be simply as a way of actually tricking people also. So you cannot make something super big about this. So you have to be able to understand simply is, again, let's not, quote unquote, get tripped up here about something of that nature, you see. I reason that the story of Jesus was indeed the story of every person, and it gains its true meaning and relevance for us only if it is seen in that light. Whether there ever was a quote so-called historical Jesus really makes no difference to the meaning of his story or mythos for our lives, which I repeated that. Significantly, I began that passage written over a decade ago with the following words. This is from Joseph Campbell. The biography of a spiritual teacher is not an account of historical fact. It is a symbol of the spiritual biography of that man, and all the elements of the biography are symbolic. Just through reading them properly, you learn the message, end quote. These are words every seminary student should be required to memorize. But most seminary students don't even go through this, folks. When I went to seminary long ago, over 20 years ago, and I didn't finish because I realized there was something wrong with it. I knew that basically something was wrong in what they were teaching, and especially with Augustine. I really took some early patristic, early church history classes, which I would read. Actually, if you do this, if you do that, it actually, if you've got some keen sense, you realize something's not right here, folks. You see, but that's not going further enough back even then with Augustine. Augustine is basically in the late 300s and early 400s. It's where he's pivotal in the church, and he actually is considered the father of not only the Catholic Church, but the quote unquote of the the Martin Luther Church, which is the Lutheran Church, and also of the Calvin perspective of the Presbyterians. I only wish I had known at the beginning of my working life and ministry nearly 50 years ago what I know now. What's much more important, though, is the inescapable conclusion that the entire course of Western history over the past 1800 years would have been far different if a more spiritual understanding of the Christ and Christianity had prevailed at the outset, instead of what Paul called the letter that kills, which is what means literalism. That's what Paul was talking about in his work, which I read last night, some of the things he shared. The church's deplorably record of persecution, wars, and other atrocities would never have taken place. Yeah, that's why they chose to, again, eliminate their enemies, so to speak. Uncounted millions would have been encouraged to nurture and bring to fruition their own moral and spiritual Christhood instead of always passively waiting for a perfect Savior from outside to do the job for them. And that is true today. That is so true today, even today, folks. Go to churches and see people are waiting for something, God to do more for them. You see. But they never ask why nothing's happening. You see, they're just going along and merrily down the stream I go, so to speak. They're not asking questions and saying, wait a minute, something's not right here. That, of course, would not have suited the ecclesiastic authorities bent on maintaining control of both bodies and soul, correct? From the outset, that is, in writing the work called The Pagan Christ, I had a number of crucial goals in mind. In particular, I wanted to address the future of the church and of the Christianity, and of Christianity, I should say, long a major passion and concern. It is only in the past few years, and then particularly during the researching and writing of this book, however, that I have come to understand the full nature of the problem and to see clearly a transforming path ahead. There is no doubt whatever that the church of the late 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries scored a great triumph in winning over the uneducated masses. Well, they won that over the uneducated masses because simply they dumbed it down. Okay? They dumbed down the message. They chose instead of to do it in a literal terms instead of an esoteric. which was a very tempting way to have power over the masses. It's a political move in a lot of ways, folks. So, but by literalizing and making a pseudo history out of the Jesus story, by making all the ancient wisdom exoteric, meaning outside of you, and commonplace, the church turned that triumph into a Pyrrhic victory of staggering proportions. Ignorance and an unquestioning faith were championed. In other words, if you question the pastor, I remember, let's go back in my life in the late 90s, I began to question the pastor at the church I was at. So I first went to my singles pastor, which I was a single guy and involved in that group very much. And I asked questions about some issues that I was having. Part of it was to do what they call the Keswick movement, which was a movement that took place back in probably the 1600s in a place called Keswick, England. And there was a talk that this church I was going to was a Presbyterian church. So it's a Calvinist viewpoint, a Reformed perspective in religion, so to speak. So I talked to my so-called single pastor at that time, and he couldn't give me any answers. And I was pushed away. And many people thought simply as I was just being a problem in some ways, even then at that point. They didn't really realize it simply as I've been digging ever since. And the problem simply is that well, you don't want to make waves here. Like, no, I'm not. This is not what you understand, sir. You don't, ma'am, or whatever. You don't understand simply. So I'm looking for the truth. So Keswick belief system is in reality it's not Presbyterian. So this is not about in reality truth for me. This was based upon my Reformed perspective. So my Reformed perspective was simply what to do with John Calvin. So I revered him in some ways, and we are Presbyterians, which John Knox was at John Calvin's place in Geneva and studied along with John Calvin, and eventually left and went to Scotland and started the Presbyterian movement. And actually, he actually helped Scots to defeat eventually later on, I mean, not him, but others. He had actually was dead and gone, but was actually involved in Scotland and actually being somewhat separate from England, so to speak. So the Keswicks believed that simply is that there was such a thing as perfectionism. And I didn't understand why my pastor at a church over 1,000 people was teaching this. And it was actually taught at Columbia Bible College, also called the Keswick movement, Keswick movement. And there was a particular guy there, the president of the school, who was also pushing that. And this particular pastor I knew at this church, at First Presbyterian Church, really were, I guess, buddies, so to speak, and they believed somewhat that. And that was a part of what they call, this church was also what they call a very missionary minded, meaning simply they were sending out missionaries to other areas of the world and were putting money out and sending, even from their own congregation, people who were actually interested in bringing people to Christ. So I did not get the answer, like I said, from two different particular associate pastor and a singles pastor. So I eventually met with the senior pastor, who was much older than I was. And he really didn't exactly answer my questions, but I still chose to go to a particular seminary that he actually taught at. Eventually, he left that church and went to a church called, not church, but seminary called Reformed Theological Seminary in Charlotte, North Carolina. I went there for one semester, took a class under this professor, my former pastor. I also took a class under church history. And the class I took in church history was basically, I guess what we call Reform history, what we call simply Reformational history, meaning the type of the strength of the church during the Reformation, which is in the early 1500s. And then I took a class on what I call, how to live a Christian life, so to speak, under the former pastor of my church, such and such a First Presbyterian Church. I passed both of the classes, did okay, but I was also told that, which I was already disappointed, which was only my first semester, the first semester simply was two classes, basically 6 hours. Da 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 da. I went on Monday's class and actually overstayed and stayed there on campus on Monday night, and then went Tuesday morning, and then came back home. As I continued to talk with other seminary students there, they were telling me about another seminary that was actually called Erskine Theological Seminary. And they said, "Hey, what are you doing here? If you want to be a church history professor, you need to go to Erskine Theological Seminary in South Carolina." And I said, "Well, it's not it's not a Presbyterian. It's a Presbyterian seminary, but it's not, it's not the PCA, which is a denomination." They were ARP, which is called the Associate Reformed Presbyterian, which is basically, they drew their roots basically from Scotland. So I actually left. That was one semester. So the next semester in the spring, I went to this church seminary called Erskine Theological Seminary in Due West, South Carolina, which in reality is in the middle of nowhere. Seriously, it is. This country is based, a little old community based upon why it's there. One reason: the seminary and the college there, Erskine College and then Erskine Theological Seminary. So I had three particular good professors there, that were teaching church history. And I really liked these guys a lot until I began to go through what I call early church history, or what they call patristics, which you start reading these things, you start looking. And then one really what stuck out to me was a class on Augustine. And that's really when I began to realize something was wrong, really wrong. And I realized simply is that, and I asked my professor, why did Augustine actually cause harm to people who actually were part of another particular church that he didn't see eye to eye with? And he said, well, that was just the way things were back then. That's not a good enough answer, folks. Sorry, it doesn't work. That's not an excuse. So I won't go more into that detail, but that was the really basically kind of woke me up, and I realized, no, not going to teach this stuff. So I actually had quite a few hours there, probably almost for me to get my master's degree. Not quite. I would have to still study Greek and Hebrew languages, which were my last few classes I wanted to take, because they were what I would consider one of the hardest classes. But basically, all it is just strictly memorization. But I chose to leave there at that point, and it was a turning point in my life. I think in reality, simply is God was testing me in some ways to realize that, okay, is this really what you want? And I was like, no, I don't want to teach. I don't want to teach lies to people. I'm not interested in that. Money's not the object here. So I left, and I've been soldiering, or so to speak, searching for a long time since then. It's been roughly over 20 years ago. Anyway, let's get back to what I was talking about. So I just want to explain that to you, because simply this is where that was the major move for me to begin to move away from that. I also had some major issues happen also in that timeline when I was right around 40 to 41 years old that basically changed my life. So all of Europe was plunged into what they call the Dark Ages. Only a month later returned to the so-called pagans, what we call Plato and Aristotle, injected sufficient rationality and philosophy into Christian theology to keep it alive at all. Today, we have a situation where the ultra-conservative wing of the church has, as a prime specimen of its devotion to credulity, that is, the U.S. President George W. Bush, the leader, is the most powerful nation on earth. Bush has said that Jesus Christ is his, quote, favorite philosopher, end quote, was once asked as a press conference what he thought about the ongoing debate in some American educational circles over creationism and the theory of evolution. The leader of the world's only superpower at that time replied that in his considered view, quote, the jury is still out on that one, end quote. Ignorance is bliss, indeed, it seems. He is surrounded by like-minded, quote unquote, born-again Christians, and the Pentagon is filled with them, who believe that a apocalyptic Armageddon, or final battle between good and evil, is currently in God's plan, and that it will be fought in and around Jerusalem. I wonder whether he has ever even heard of the concept of self-fulfilling prophecy. However scary that product of a literalist reading of the Bible and of simply a Revelation especially, which is Phil Langdon has actually done a book that is to deal with Revelation. It has nothing to do with that. Has nothing to do with that. Has nothing even to do with prophecy, folks. That's when you read the Bible wrongly and how you do things. So in reality, what we do today simply is that we jump all over the Catholics and what they did, but in reality, the Protestants are doing the same thing. Okay? They're reading the book literally, and they're saying, okay, this is the final battle, the battle of Armageddon. You see? Maybe there's a little reason for joy even when we look to the liberal wing of Christianity too. So we're looking at two wings of Christianity, which is what we call the conservatives and the liberals. Take, for example, the Jesus Seminar, the California-based scholars who for years now have been subjecting the New Testament to the most rigorous of scrutinies to determine what is bedrock and what is not. Though obviously they are the opposites of fundamentalists, they share the same basic assumption that behind the whole Jesus story, there is a historical kernel, if they can only find it. What they have found is so meager that is frankly will not serve as sustaining, energizing spiritual food for today's men and women. Let me get a drink of water here. Once you assume historicity and train the full glare of historical research on the Bible, the entire edifice begins to crumble. As I have argued, it is not about history, unless by that you mean the inner story of the human mind and heart and its dealings with the divine. To realize what Jesus was and still remains the supreme dramatic symbol of the divinity within us all. See, he's not outside of us, folks. Never has been, which is what the church has taught. He's outside of you. They have to have a historical Jesus. That is, they've got to have it. If there's no historical Jesus, the whole thing, the edifice falls. Their temple that they've created will fall because there is no historical Jesus, folks. And I think certain people are starting to see that. That's why not only the Catholic faith is losing people, but the Protestants are also losing tremendously amount of people because people realize something's not right. They don't understand, but they know something's wrong. To understand that the Christ is the divine essence of our nature, that his story is a dramatic representation of a deep element of human consciousness, to see the symbolic quality of all Scripture, all of this has made me deeply aware of the tremendously significant message I had to try to clarify and make as widely known as possible. Religion does not have to continue to be the sadly divisive part of the world's problems, as we shall see in a moment. The doctrine of the incarnation I have described here at some length gives us a basic for universal recognition of one another as brothers and sisters in God. I trust that in arguing this case and presenting the evidence, I have succeeded in bringing to a much wider audience the work of a man I have come to regard as one of the single greatest geniuses of the 20th century. That is Alvin Boyd Kuhn. His last name is Kuhn. I recommend you read him. Seriously. From my own length, experience, and background, I can safely say that he towers above all others of recent memory and intellect and his understanding of the world's religions. Kuhn has, I believe, more to offer the church just now than all the scholars of the Jesus Seminar together. Well, I was to say that simply it would have more to do even with the quote-unquote Protestants and Catholics today. You see, they don't add up. They're not significant. More than John Spong, S-P-O-N-G, which is a major key guy at this point, back then, not now. I think he's already passed away also. Much more than his contemporary C.S. Lewis, more than Joseph Campbell or Matthew Fox. I remain stunned at the silence with which his writings have been greeted by scholars. Ordinary lay people can be forgiven. He is anything but an easy read. By everyone else, his work has been deliberately, though subtly, ignored or suppressed. I hope the pagan Christ will play a strong role in changing all that. He's talking about Alvin Boyd Kuhn here again. Here then are and this is why I don't understand why people, you give people, I read the books, most of this book, not all of them. I probably read 15 or 20 of them. And most people are not even, they don't even pursue this. You see, strong role in changing all that. Here then are the 9 areas where my thinking has been challenged and transformed. The areas I believe are more pregnant with hope for the future. I hope he's correct. Number 1, makes the Bible come alive. The enigma of the Bible has been largely solved. You see, dark passages, cryptic narratives, or events all have been shot through with a new thought long last light because of this awareness that the key to all Scripture is to be found in the doctrine of incarnation. Once you really understand that all the myths, legends, stories, histories, allegories, parables, and symbols are a particular kaleidoscope or perspective of variations on this one central theme, the Bible comes alive in a wholly new way. That's WHOLLY. I have found. This is a theme I plan to explore in much greater detail someday. In the meantime, it is particularly important to remember that the Bible books were never, quote, written, end quote, in any normal modern sense. From the beginning, they were preserved in memory only. They make up the body of what is known as the great oral tradition, a set of ritual formulas, ceremonial rites, allegorical depreciation of truth, myths, number graphs, and pictorial symbols of the realities and the phenomena of human spiritual history that has been handed down from generation to generation in unwritten form. Only here and there, chiefly to avoid their being lost, forgotten, or too badly corrupted by change, they were set down in writing and so as last come to later ages as books, presumably, quote, written, end quote, or edited or revised by somebody. Kuhn says, and he documents this thoroughly, that once written, they became subject to the usual human proclivities of tampering, altering, and religious skullduggery of many kinds. The fact that they met with this treatment not only is admitted by historians of Christianity in its early stages, as we have seen, but it is boasted of by the scribes and some of the church fathers who thus resorted to unholy means to achieve holy ends. I quote again from Ephesus, a letter from St. Gregory Nazianzus, one of the most respected theologians of the early centuries, of his close friend St. Jerome. St. Jerome was actually, he doesn't say this, but St. Jerome is a Latin guru at that time. I should say guru, but Latin strength because he was basically, that was part of Rome, in which he says, quote, nothing can impose better on a people than verbiage. The less they understand, the more they admire. Our fathers and doctors had often said, not what they thought, but that to which circumstances and necessity forced them, end quote. It really changes our understanding profoundly, I should say, to realize that the books of the Bible were never written in the modern understanding of literary scholarship. They were largely the final deposit on vellum or papyrus or formulas acted out and retold down through the ages. They were often direct transcriptions of the lines recited by actors in the great mystery plays of the ancient religion. Not only are former Bible riddles solved when we reach this new understanding, but the text makes sense as never before. Take, for example, that well-known gospel incident of Jesus walking on water and stilling a storm. If you see this not as some supernatural trick, but as a powerful symbolic representation of the Christ within, calming, quote, the troubling ocean, end quote, of our inner fears and instilling a sense of peace, you are released from the intellectual impossibilities of believing in a God-man who defies gravity and is wholly beyond emulation today. Yeah, my point simply is the whole idea of a God-man is doesn't make any sense. That's why they have to have this historical Jesus, guys. You see, because the scaffolding of the whole belief system in Christianity would come apart if there was no historical Jesus, because that's what it's based upon. And once you see that there was no historical Jesus, then it all falls apart. It doesn't hold water, you see. And that's what's happening somewhat already. If we see the various, quote, miraculous, end quote, healings as a dramatic, mythical reference to the healing power of the Christ within each one of us, and if we see such otherwise incomprehensible and magical events, as in brackets here, such as the feeding of thousands by multiplying bread or turning water into wine, as symbolically or God's gift to each of us in the divine energies by which we live and grow, the passage hits home in an entirely new way. As Kuhn says, the Gospels are the story of our souls. Quote, the birth, the awakening of intellectual power at age 12, the temptation or stress or conflict between the body and the soul, the development of the soul's divine potentiality to heal the ills and weakness of the flesh, the overcoming and casting out of demonic forces of the natural man by the Christ influence, the symbolic raising of the dead, inert spiritual power to a new birth of life. The whole experience of the soul under the long domination of the animal instinct being itself the essence of crucifixion on the cross of matter. Now, I want to say something before I finish here. 12 is a significant number. It's always a significant number in the Bible, and so is 3. 3 is metaphysical. So when you see of 3 things, what we call, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, it's metaphysics. Okay? It's not literal. Okay? This is another stumbling block that people have. So we go back to the cross. This is why you have to have a completely different perspective. Okay? And Phil Langdon shares this in his books and reveals deepness, I shouldn't say deepness, but deeper perspective of what really is going on here. And they're all stories. There's no reality to it at all. There is no Abraham. There was no Lot. There was no, what's his name, Noah. There was none of these people. Those are names, but those names have a meaning behind them, and we actually don't pursue looking at find out what those names mean, you see, because they're telling us something else. It's much deeper. That's why it's esoteric. So the cross of matter, the final victory in the soul radiant transfiguration of the mortal man by the Spirit's light. That is the ultimate resurrection of the soul out of its death under the suffocating heaviness that is of life of sense. End quote. There is no doubt that this ultimate transforms our entire understanding of the ancient texts. There is indeed then a potent wisdom in the Bible, hidden though it is in necessity imagery, that bites on our personal and communal lives together as nothing else can do. The next part of this chapter is that it calls it inspires fresh hope for a cosmic faith. All the research done for this book has helped me bring to my faith a fully spiritual comprehension of what once bogged down and otherwise outmoded, or outmoded, I should say, credible, I should say, and other accumulations. I really believe that applying the truth so clearly revealed by our studies means that the original, more truly spiritual Christianity of the first 2 centuries can be recovered for the first time, something I have been searching for all my adult life. Namely, a basis for a universal cosmic Christianity has been rendered a possibility. The view of faith outlined here is one that not hopes, but knows no boundaries of set or creed, because it is based on the universal truth of the, quote, light that light up every person coming into the world, end quote. It belongs to all, regardless of ethnicity, color, or clime. Significantly, it applies to the millions of humans who were born and died long before Christianity as a religion was ever thought of. It belongs to the now, to the future as well. Whatever the defenders of Orthodox have to say, and I am well aware it will be plenty, they cannot deny that the literalist exclusive Christianism that is held by the majority of churches, quote, our church and our view of Jesus remain the only way, end quote, is extremely divisive and will never lead to the solidarity of all humanity. It remains a serious source of global disharmony and at times victorious open conflict. The theologian Hans Kung, K-U-N-G, has said repeatedly that there will never be global peace until there is harmony between the world's great religions, especially Islam and Christianity. But this will never happen while Christians claim to hold a monopoly on divine truth. I am not pleading here for one total homogeneous faith to replace the current religious pluralism. Not at all. Rather, I'm urging the adoption of a profoundly unifying basis to transcend the divisive outlook that so often accompanies our traditional differences. As the poet W.H. Auden, A-U-D-E-N, has warned us, we must either learn to love or die. Using the words, quote, the Christ, end quote, is important for would-be Christians, but if only religion used other terms such as Atman, spirit, soul, the higher self, we must realize that they're still speaking of the same inter-reality. As Kuhn says in his most recent book, A Rebirth for Christianity, Quote, if Christianity will now recognize that the time has come to join with the other great living religious traditions and direct its vision to the reawakening of the divine spirit, the Christos in man, it may yet vindicate its right to call it message, the true religion of humanity, end quote. If you recognize the divine presence in another person, you cannot harm him or suffer your brother into injustice. The words of Northrop Frye, which is a Canadian professor, I think it was at, what's his name? I'm trying to think of his name. He was a teacher in Toronto. Anyway, whom I quote near the beginning of our exploration, resonates with fresh power for me now. Just before his death, he wrote, quote, I think immense change could be brought about by a Christianity that was no longer crippled by notions of heresy, infallibility, or exclusiveness of a kind that should be totally renounced and not rationalized in the slightest degree. Such a Christianity might represent the age of the Spirit, end quote. That's the new vision. Next section we'll talk about is number 3, clarify the ancient symbols. For the first time for me, a spiritual, mystical understanding of the Christ myth had made powerful, relevant the whole doctrine of the cross, the crucifixion, and the resurrection of the Christ. All the old business about blood and sacrifice and suffering gods finally comes into focus and grasps hold of both mind and heart. The love of God is seen more clearly than ever in the, quote, sacrifice, end quote, our constant outpouring of the divine nature to secure our share in it forever. The mythical allegorical meaning of the passion of Jesus Christ as an enactment of God's role in our creation and our incarnation as embodied, quote, fragments of deity, end quote, is far more profound than some imaginary transaction where God, wrath, is nullified by the literal death of an only son. The above point leads to my renewed awareness of the power and the symbolism of the Eucharist itself. It is no longer a crude, barbarous echo of some kind of Kabbalism rite, nor is it a purely polite, symbolic recalling of a 2,000-year-old event. It graphically and powerfully offers a immediate experience of inward, that is feeding, F-E-E-D-I-N-G, end quote, upon the facts that the divine has poured out in energies and life as our spiritual bread and drink. And it is a dramatic experience of, quote, remembering, end quote, in the sense of bringing back together all the various fragments of the, quote, body, end quote, of God. It is the potent symbol of the restoration of the whole family of humanity as the child of God. Number 4, it underlines the dangers of literalism. Once the literalist approach to the Gospels and the rest of the Bible has been seen for the great blunder it has been, and in some places remains today, the perilous habit of targeting specific groups and lacerating them by quoting, quote, proof texts, end quote, loses all its presumed authority. Most of the atrocities committed by the church and its more rabid followers down through the ages have been directly inspired by literalist thinking. The lies, for example, behind all the, well, anti-Jewish bigotry and hatred that has so tragically marked the history of Christianity almost from its inception and thus culminated that is in the Holocaust. The church did not kill 6 million Jews, obviously, but centuries of a literal reading of the Passion narrative, especially the words in Matthew, well, his blood be upon us and our children, end quote, and the anti-Jewish teaching of a continuous train of Christian theologians down to and including Martin Luther himself make it possible for the Holocaust to occur. Even at present, hatred towards Jews, homosexuals, Muslims, and others is still being encouraged in some quarters by extreme biblical literalists. The biblical expositions given here, I repeat, utterly destroy this dangerous fundamentalist exegesis once and for all. We will never have peace on earth as long as literalism controls religion. As Origen, the vigorous foe of literalism, rightly said so long ago, quote, very many mistakes have been made, quote, interpreting scripture, brackets, because the right method of examining the holy text had not been discovered by the greater number of readers, end quote. See, this is how you make the change here, folks, in a long perspective. But I'm not, I don't always agree with this guy, so I'm not going to agree with some of the things he makes, but I am reading the book because I feel it's important that you understand some of the things he's talking about. And he is basically a much lighter than Alvin Boyd Kuhn. And what I want you to do is to begin to look into Alvin Boyd Kuhn's works because he's far deeper even than this guy is. Okay. 5, emphasis our responsibility for our own evolution. The kind of spirituality which I have written here often offers a full response to what I believe to be the cardinal quest of contemporary human beings and their hunger for God. It offers living experience in the place of dry dogma. It offers a emphasis on experiencing the God within in the quote now end quote, instead of a wishful looking back over 2,000 years to an unreachable idea, a hero who, as Carl Jung warned, appeared unique and therefore forever unrepeatable end quote. Rather than encouraging the belief that all we have to do is depend on the works and moral perfections of a peerless wonder worker from long ago. Such a spirituality calls for the individual to take fullest responsibility for his or her own moral struggles. You see, this is important. He or she is aided, to be sure, by the constant presence of the Christ Spirit within. The call is, as St. Paul often reminds us, to work out our own salvation. And Paul is right. You are supposed to work out your salvation. Not someone has never done it. There's no Jesus that did this for you, folks. See, in fact, he says also, and not only work it out, in fear and trembling. In other words, it's a hey, this is pretty serious stuff. I need to figure this out. Okay, I need to work out my salvation. I need to discover truth. You see, in other words, it stimulates vigorous moral effort rather than dampening it. Yeah, most people are just said, hey, I got a ticket out of here. That's what people think. Most people in the literalist camps think that Jesus died for me, really, and there was no really Jesus there. That's the literalist point. The point is that no literal historical Son of God was ever sent to earth to transfigure and transform each of us by some remote magic, which is just crazy, and thus saves us from the evolutionary task of transfiguring ourselves. Yes, the responsibility is for us ourselves. That's the responsibility. That's what Paul is talking about. It's your responsibility to grow up and be a man. Stop playing around and playing games. You see. But when you go in churches after, you keep going back and forth, keep going there over and over. That all it is simply is keeping there. You're not going anywhere. You're not growing spiritually because you've never done anything spiritually. You never have. Human beings will never really be successful oriented towards this task until they realize that within their own minds and body dwells the divine power that is in to be raised up and glorified in us. And that's what Phil Langdon talks about. See. Paul reminded his followers of Corinth, quote, don't you know that you are the temple of God and that the Spirit of God dwells within you? And this is where Christians quote this. Let me explain it. They quote this as though once they become Christians, this is them. No, 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 no. You got it all wrong, honey. It has nothing to do with that. In fact, you being outside the church and never went to Christianity, you need to know that you are the temple of God and that the Spirit of God dwells in and within you. You need to find him because he dwells within you. You need to find him. You're not going to find him when you go to a Christian church, neither. You're not. You're not in this day and time. Even when he's hopefully talking about here, this whole idea Tom is talking about, is hopeful he's talking about. But the reality simply is the responsibility takes place now. You need to do this. It's urgent. God has called us to full responsibility for our own evolution. In other words, to grow up, find God within us, our own actions. It is only when the knowledge becomes a certainty that the individual can truly begin to focus his or her psyche energies upon stirring into full awakening the latent nature of the God within. It's the only effective way, forward, morally, and spiritual. I'm reminded here of what Carl Jung said about the weaknesses of the old imitation of Christ approach. Jung obviously had nothing against people trying to be loving and kind, but he said, in the imitation of Christ will forever have this disadvantage. We worship a man as a divine model, embodying the deepest meaning of life. And then out of sheer imitation, we forget to make real the profound meaning present in ourselves. You see, you got to do it, as he's saying, as Jung says, Carl Jung. But no one's doing it, you see. Oh, it's a gift. No, it's not a gift. You got to find it within you. If I accept the fact that a God, this little g, is absolute and beyond all human experience, he leaves me cold. I do not affect him, nor does he affect me. But if I know, on the other hand, that God, capital G, is a mighty activity within my own soul, at once I must concern myself with him. End quote. Yes, it is important. If we follow a Christ out there, in other words, while ignoring the kingdom of God or the Christ within, authentic transformation never occurs. Continue here. Number 6 highlights nature's guiding role. Nature and the material world are far more integrative to the spirituality outlined here, while literalist Christianism tends to rely on a supernatural, magical, or overworldly view of life and the universe. The ancient wisdom presented here is as the matrix out of which true spiritual Christianity emerged is entirely holistic and rooted in our natural reality that comprehends the entire cosmos. The solipsistic economical basis of Christmas and Easter alone provides a natural symbolism for the deepest truths of each individual spiritual life. The heavens do indeed, quote, declare the glory of God, end quote, as the psalmist says. The first thing that strikes a novice studying ancient Egyptian religion is a large part played in it by a daily awareness of nature and its role everywhere around us as teacher and guide. There are deep implications here for our urgent environmental concerns and hosts of other current issues. I now never looked at the clear night sky without recalling that Orion is the timeless figure of the heavenly Christ. The three stars of the belt have been known for millennia as the three kings or wise men. I never see the moon now without being reminded of its reflecting the solar glory and its monthly telling of the story of our incarnation and ultimate resurrection. The ideas of see, all of these things are supposed to strike your imagination. You see, the ideas of ancients regarding the evolution of the universe in general, or of humanity, especially individual humans, in particular, resonate so closely with contemporary scientific thought. What ignorance once called primitive, religion taught that at a certain point in evolution, when the mineral had given rise to the vegetable, then to the animal. So what he's quoting here right now is from Geometry of Meaning here, from the book called by author M. Young. He's talking about that right here. Okay. Then to the animal, the process could go no further. What was needed was metaphorically, quote, stooping down, end quote, to descent of, or the sacrifice, end quote, of spirit to inject a fresh and highly impulse to the process. Symbolically, the God, quote, died in order to be fragmented and then incarnated into the highest, quote, humanoid animal souls, which is talking about human beings. That is the evolutionary, quote, moment, end quote, described in the first two chapters of Genesis, when the human was made in God likeness, that is mythical speaking, and Adam became a, quote, living soul, end quote. Soon after, in the myth, Adam and Eve, eyes were opened, end quote, and moral awareness was born. With this kind of understanding, all the years of conflict between religion and science are seen for what they were: sheer nonsense and a sad waste of both time and lives. Number 7, explain what the Jesus story really means to us. While showing the deep reverence of the Jesus story and the persona of Jesus for the life and spiritual growth of every Christian, this fresh view of the faith leads to an escape from the false religion involved in the current idolatrous cult of a personal Jesus. End quote. By showing him to have been deeply true in the mythical sense rather than the literal as God. The vast theological offense currently given to the majority of other faiths, particularly Islam and Judaism, is not simply mitigated, it is entirely removed. Thus lies once a way to interfaith understanding that otherwise can never exist. This has enormous potential for world peace, since there is currently an underlying religious dimension to almost every conflict on the face of the globe. I have found that seeing the Jesus story for what it is, a profoundly spiritual allegory of the soul, in no way detracts from the moral and social teachings that for so many centuries have been so deeply connected with his assumed deeds. Unquestionably, this story has produced an infinite outpouring of compassionate activities through down the ages. I would never for a moment question the positive contributions to human welfare of traditional Christianity. But whatever the source of the teaching in the Gospels, that is, see, for example, Luke 4:17 through 19, which is clearly directed from the Old Testament. However, much of it is in turn owed to the Egyptians, thus relevant and urgent for the human consciousness remains precisely the same. They are wholly, WHOLLY, unchallenged or weakening in any way. Justice is always justice, whether expressed in hieroglyphics, Hebrew, Greek, or English. The inspiration of Jesus Christ as portrayed in the gospel is in no way lessened or lesser by the knowledge that each of us has potential for birthing the Christ within and for living that out up to every full maturity. Quite the contrary, as Paul told the Galileans, the aim of all efforts and teaching was that the Christ might be fully, quote, formed in you. And I'm going to stop here at this point. I've got something going on, so I'm going to have to stop. And I'll finish this up in a little while. Okay? All right. Thank you.